We are live.
Hi,
Hello.
hello, hi everyone. Good
So,
morning, afternoon, evening, wherever
afternoon, good
you are.
morning, yeah. Good evening, good night, good afternoon, good morning to everyone around the world. Thanks for tuning in. It's 3 p.m. for us. We know it's pretty late for some of y'all, but thank you very much if you're tuning in from like late night your time. So today we are Shao and I. We're from the Curious Chimeras. We're going to be talking about some Southeast Asian perspectives and how we work with culture and heritage in our game design, as well as talk about some maybe trends that we've seen in other parts of Southeast Asia. So
Okay, right.
let's
Next
do
one,
a self. Yep, let's do a little bit of self
self-introduction.
introduction just to give you an idea of what we do. So my name's Alana. This is Shao in the screen. We are basically we're basically the Curious Chimeras. So what we do is we write TTRPGs. We do a lot of immersive experiences now, actually, where it's kind of like a cross between escape rooms and um, educational experiences and things like that, which ties in largely to our idea of um, creating immersive experiences. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how culture and heritage ties into those experiences. Shao also writes for Pathfinder and various other franchises. Shao, do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Oh, okay, yeah. Hi. I work on. I'm Shao. I'm happy to be here. Was a kind of I think was a member of was a guest invited to Prepare Con in 2022 as one of the POC scholars. So I do some freelance work, and I'm going to be largely talking about my indie work rather than my freelance work. So my freelance work is mostly for other companies and creating things. So the work I've done some stuff for Place in the Dark for Evil Hat. I've done some things for Pathfinder for the Four Delta Green by Pelgreen. And also I work sometimes as a cultural consultant on things behind. Been doing some things mostly kind of like a wearing between different hats and learning different things in my freelance work. And sometimes very much my work gets asked to the what I get asked to do is for cultural consulting to check whether something is appropriate or suitable or whether there's any unpredicted kind of like nuances or inflections. There's a lot for my freelance work. Today, I'll be talking about my indie work with Heroes Cameras because it's a company that Alana and myself, we own and we work with. So I'll be talking a lot about culture in my indie work today. Yeah, back over to you, Alana.
Okay, let's head on to the next slide. So just a little bit about, like, just kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about today. The title is Some Southeast Asian Perspectives. So I think first and foremost, we kind of need to talk about what does being Southeast Asian mean, and not just Southeast Asian, but our our very particular experiences as being Singaporean, and what does that mean in the idea of Southeast Asian as well. We want to talk a little bit about what culture and heritage means in this particular context, and as we're talking about these particular ideas of culture and heritage, we'll bring in our experiences based on how we have worked with the current markets and audiences. We'll also talk about our constraints and the opportunities that have been given to us via these ideas of culture and heritage.
Yeah.
So
All right, to
so
the
to
next
start
slide.
off, we're going yep. To start off, we're going to be talking about what
Ah,
does Southeast Asian mean anyway. So Shao, being the Southeast Asian historian in this company, is going to tell you a little bit more
okay.
about that.
Okay. Hi, hello. Yeah, basically, I guess just to kind of put a bit of framing to make things like well we'll talk about Southeast Asian here. So basically I'm sure over Big Bad Online as well as like in other things. I'm sure some of you may have heard of this RPG SEA hashtag and it's kind of like a movement that went about. So for us we've been around with this movement for as part of like people working with this movement for quite a while since its inception as a bit of a discussion. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the SEA instead of the RPG in this RPGC. So what does Southeast Asia mean? And I think the thing is I'd like you to kind of take a look at this map that we have, right, of RPG, of SEA, right? And also the very political nature of this work. Like essentially we have Southeast Asia. We want to talk a little bit about the countries, the politics, the kind of like the material conditions of creation that happen within there, and we also want to observe some patterns that emerge out. So, and the caveat here is that since both of us are from Singapore, which is a very tiny spot of Southeast Asia, it's so tiny you can't see it on the map, right? Like a physical representation of it. But we don't mean to represent all of Southeast Asia or even most of it. What we do is to share our opinions as experiences as Singaporean creators and offer perhaps some kind of larger patterns or correlations that we generalize from our particular subjective experiences. So, are there any big hypotheses or big claims here, like this is the case for all Southeast Asian creators? This is the fate of all Southeast Asian creators. So, we're not interested in making such big theoretical claims, right? Because we don't have neither the evidence nor the capacity to make such things. So, you look here, right? Very much, right? Like Southeast Asia, like for us in basically academia, Southeast Asian studies is divided very much into, depends on who is studying Southeast Asia. If it's the Chinese and the Indian Southeast Asian scholars from a long time ago, we're talking about basically we're talking about pre-modern kind of eras, right? So you have like historians from China and India, from ancient Greece, they are talking about Southeast Asia as sort of a land of gold, and pretty much like as we got later into the era of the European colonial expansions, pretty much what you consider Southeast Asia depends on which colonial force was involved in exploring and carving out land for themselves. So why am I mentioning this colonial history as being a large part of it? It's because Southeast Asia, by the time that people understand anything about Asia, most of the time people may think of Asia as being dominated, and the ideas of Asia may be influenced by the two big powers in our region, culturally and politically, of India, South Asia, China, East Asia, the most powerful and like the longest histories in the area. So for a long time, people may look at Southeast Asia as being some kind of, all right, is this some kind of indecized place? Is this a Sinicized place? All right. There are the people here. Oh, all right. We have Buddhists in Southeast Asia, but Buddhism comes from a part of India. So therefore, we don't need to really look at Southeast Asia being something special. We can understand Southeast Asia through perhaps a South Asian lens, and or like a Vietnam has like Confucian elements and Mahayana Buddhist elements. All right, that sounds like something that happens in China as well. Can we apply a lens in which you understand China to understand Vietnam, and so on and so forth? So that's pretty much kind of one of the filters that happens, and also the history of our region is one based in political struggle, and we have a lot of former colonies that have gained their independence from basically colonial authorities over the world, right? So for me, we're here, we're from Singapore, and we speak English because our education system is very much something that was based on the British, kind of like our responses to British colonization was to make ourselves, I guess, self-colonize ourselves to become even more Anglo. And so we end up speaking and working with English quite comfortably. And if our neighbors up north in Malaysia that we were once one part of the same nation, we were part of Malaya before there was a political separation, you might also notice that you may notice a lot of game designers from Malaysia and Singapore that you can recognize because our works are in English. But for so many other places across Southeast Asia, there are like cultural universes, linguistic universes that many people might not get access to. So when you see RPGC, I guess the big thing that I want to ask here is um, how much representation, right, of Southeast Asia exists inside there, and what could be going on inside all these interesting areas, right, that exist within, I guess, the large realm of RPG or any kind of game-like activity, right, that could be happening that we're not aware of. For example, something that could be hyper-local, something that could be linked over to things that do not see traditionally as a game, as we understand it as an industry. So what does this kind of like mean over here is that I guess I want to talk about is that some countries, right, in the understanding of the international RPG industry, of like international RPG representations are better represented than others. So obviously those countries, right, that have traditionally a stronger relationship with the US, for example, would have a better easy access to US market. So I was able to get basically go to Big Bad Online in 2022, largely because of like my I guess the fact that my work could be found more easily in English. I can speak in English. I can work with I can work with the other RPGC representatives and scholars inside there a bit easier. And so you're going to notice more Filipinos, more Singaporeans, more Malaysians, and that doesn't mean that we have. That does not necessarily mean that there's some like special talents that we found inside these areas. Like we have been trying to connect with different people in different places, right? But very much right, whatever information is available now of like what RPGs in Southeast Asia could be is still very much a work in progress. There's still so many potential makers, games creators, traditions, styles of play that are different across different places. And what does that mean over for us, right? So is that the demand for TTRPG products also differs throughout Southeast Asia. So essentially, very much we are in the situation of being the Asia Pacific for a lot of people's markets. So what happens is that a lot of the demand and supply that comes in here may be kind of like influenced from either larger Asian markets, in which people think about Southeast Asia as a subset of Asian markets, or the Pacific markets, in which people think of Southeast Asia as a Australian or a New Zealand-based kind of market. So, for example, so you're going to find that in our RPG conventions here locally in the region, you're going to find a lot more big representations as well, mixed with like indie stuff, because indie stuff, people have passion for it. They create their own freelance and indie things. But largely, you're going to find representation of RPG products is going to be dominated by juggernauts, by franchises, by things with like big IPs. All right. And so, what does that mean for creators and consumers in this market? I guess what we really want to talk about is I want to kind of like draw upon some questions, right? To raise some questions for people, right? What kind of experiences do we have? Okay, what kind of patterns can we emerge? For us, we're really quite dependent upon working with people from different places. We try to create works that would appeal to different markets across the world. Some of us are able to work with diasporas that exist, perhaps for our particular own ethnicity or nationality. So, for example, if I was I don't think Singapore has a very large population. It's a very tiny country. So if I wanted to, all right, get international kind of like connections with other Singaporean diasporas, the market would necessarily be smaller. But if I came from a bigger country with stronger connections, whether it's post-colonial relations or economic relations, let's say with like, I may sell better if I was able to find a larger diaspora to market to. But when would my experiences be generalizable across? Would there be any kind of cultural resonance? So if you're thinking of like how to work with culture and heritage in your work, I think a large part of it is also considering and thinking a little bit about things are very different in when we talk about culture and heritage, depending on where we live and where we are in the world. And so, for example, my work right might be considered to be all right. Shao has done work for, I think one of the things that's coming up for Pathfinder 2 is the Tianxia, the Asian inspired continent that happens in the country, in the setting of Pathfinder 2. But what happens is like, if I was to be seen, perhaps like, all right, I'm able to understand Mandarin, I'm able to understand English, I can write in both, I can work in both. But for somebody who is inside, for example, let's say the Chinese, the mainland Chinese, the Chinese national, then we're wondering why is there a representative of like why isn't it created by somebody from China? What gives me, a member of the Chinese diaspora in Singapore, the ability to represent all of that? So these are all kind of questions that come out a lot for us in Southeast Asia because for us as creators, right? It's like uh, to what degree can we say we represent things? For if your country is big, if you have a longer history, you have a larger nation, you have a bigger population, you can talk about your own culture set. But I think for us Singaporeans, we represent a very unusual Southeast Asian experience as well because we're a tiny country that doesn't have a very long history. We don't have the ability to draw upon a kind of like a easy way to say this is a medieval Singapore. Like the imagination history of that isn't as clear for us. So I can't say, all right, I'm making, let's say, like my friends and colleagues, I can't say, oh, I'm making an Indonesian style game. If I did one, even though Singapore's culture in the past would be like similar to Indonesia's in the past, I may be people might say, oh, you are not doing something authentically Singaporean, doing something that's more Indonesian flavor. Why can't I do something more Singaporean? If it was to talk about Singapore food culture, my colleagues in Malaysia may say, oh, the dishes and the cuisine they're talking about, this is a Malaysian food. You guys don't actually have any access to these cultural assets, which is something that happens a lot in another realm, in the realm of food and heritage politics in Southeast Asia. So for creators and consumers, I guess, if you're interested in Southeast Asian creators, I guess, please note that any Southeast Asian creator doesn't represent all of Southeast Asia because it's very diverse. Secondly, language-wise, the things you can see, hear, access, read may not be the only ones there. Translations may not even exist. And they might also be games that are not considered games. They may be games which are not marketed as like magazines or pop culture products or streams or anything. There may be games that are more like experiences because the media flows that work here are quite different. So I guess like with this, right, I sort of like pass this back over to Alana. Alana?
So, just thinking about this in mind, and just going off about what Shao said about Singapore as being particularly positioned in terms of how culture and heritage rich we are in that sense. Um, so how do we, as in how do Curious Chimeras, then use culture in our games? So we actually brought three examples here today. Uh, where we'll talk about culture in three different forms, I guess, in our games, as well as how we think creators can use culture. So for one, culture as a draw, so as a pool for people to want to come and play a game. Culture as content, and culture as nuance. So these will be the kind of three branches we'll be going down and talking about using examples of our own games. So I have a question here. It says, is there a narrative or a story of a piece of your culture close to your heart that you have always wanted to write into a game? And I thought that it's a kind of interesting because the first example that we're going to talk about, the singlet RPG, is actually kind of what I've wanted to do. So if we go into that first example, so the Singlet RPGs, Singlet stands for Singapore Literature. So we were commissioned by the Singapore Writers Festival 2 years ago, to or was it last year? Couple of years ago.
2 years.
Time is a construct. Um, to write RPGs for two Singlet books. So one of it was The Gatekeeper. It's an award-winning historical kind of epic, fantasy epic. And the other is the Teenage Textbook, which actually is a piece of Singlet from my youth. Um, and so what we did was, so Shao did The Gatekeeper, and he did this long, um, epic journey with in the world of Gatekeeper, where there was in the history of Gatekeeper, like the prequel sort
Yeah,
of
yeah,
thing,
like
yeah. And
I
for
think
the
like
teenage,
yeah. Go sorry, go on. Yeah.
go ahead. You did
Oh, like because like the funny thing about about cultures of draw is that the gatekeeper was because the author because we did this books with blessing the author, and the author basically had said that they are not sure whether they would like to continue. Noralia said she's not sure whether she has a sequel planned out soon or later, and so we couldn't create something, a game that was based in narrative structure in the future. And so I ended up working with her writer's notes to create kind of like something that happened as a prequel over to the Gatekeeper within the book. So it was a bit of like it was quite fun to basically be able to kind of work with the writer's notes to basically create something entirely, I guess, like orthogonal over to the original text. Yeah. Okay, over back to you, Lana.
No worries. So for the game that I did for the Teenage Textbook, that was so I had a lot of free reign with that because that's kind of like a done deal already. It was written in 1988, and it was yes, my age is showing. 1988. It had a sequel. It had movies. It had films. Like there was a whole world around it already. So if you go on to the next slide, Shao, please. So what I did for that was actually kind of like a so I used Bubble Gumshoe, and I did like kind of like a who done it. So all the characters in the books were NPCs, and then players would kind of like sleuth out, like just teenage mystery sort of things. So all the people who came were people around my age, so in their 30s or 40s, and they came in, and then they were thrown back into their JC days, the junior college days of like 18, 17, 18. I before we played the game, I took out all these props to show them, like, oh, do you remember the Nokia handphone? Oh, do you remember the overhead projector? Oh, do you remember when you went to school? It was this 3 month system, and it really got into it, and that's culture, I guess. So it's a culture. Of course, we kind of are selling the idea of nostalgia, but that nostalgia was tied very much into a kind of intangible culture that my players were very interested in. So we had
Yeah.
people. I mean, nobody knows what bubblegum shoe is, right? Like in Singapore, no. I mean, yeah, in Singapore, nobody knows what bubblegum shoe is. So there is that first hurdle already. People are
Yeah.
not coming to play bubblegum shoe. People are coming to play a character
Yeah.
in the teenage textbook. To
Yeah.
a lot of the, we ran two sessions of this, and in both sessions, people didn't know what an RPG was even. They just knew that there was a game that was going to be based off this very well beloved book that they loved, and they wanted to be part of that again. So um, when we were playing it, they started really getting into all of those very hyper local stuff. It's so local that I think only, even in Singapore, I think only a part of Singaporeans really relate to this. The JC system, for instance, is kind of, I mean, it's a gate kept thing because of education. Like you have to have a certain score before you can go into JC, so on and so forth. So the setting for these books was in a JC, so there was already that first gap, obviously. Um, and uh, family, the idea of family dynamics. So again, of course, to remember, this was written in 1988, so the context was, of course, a little bit different back then.
Yeah.
But these things at the same time were relatable to the players, and in that sense, it was part of their culture that they remembered from the 90s. And so this is what they came for. So that's why we talk about like culture as a draw for people to come um, and play a game.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, can we use culture as a draw? Maybe. It's a little bit
Yeah.
harder for Singaporeans, I think, as to think about Singaporean culture as a draw because, like we said, that it's when we think about culture of the five Fs, right? Food, fashion, flex. Um, sorry, the three Fs: food, fashion, and flex. Like, it's a bit harder for us, for Singaporeans, to make a claim to these three options. Yep.
Yeah.
Let's go
Yeah.
into the next. Mhm.
Okay.
Oh, do you have
Could I
anything to
add
say, Shao?
something here? Yeah,
Yeah, go
like
ahead.
so. I guess like for some context of like the JC system. So for us, we're a former British colony, so part of the Commonwealth. So we adopted. We are basically still holding on to some systems that I think even the United Kingdom has left. So our system education here is we go from they kind of the adapted version is that essentially they put you in very strenuous examinations from very young, and then they kind of like figure out that all right, what is your likelihood to succeed in academic standards according to your early results, and they put you into different streams. So the JC we're talking about essentially for a long time was the elite system, in which is pretty much, I guess, kind of like a high school kind of system. So students in JC will be 17 to 18 years old. So essentially, if you did good grades, you'll basically be filtered into the junior college system, which is where most of the elite schools in like when I say elites, it's like people with generational wealth and connection over to political and cultural elites in Singapore. So pretty much it's like it's 2 years. You've got 2 years, and of that 2 years, basically you're 17 to 18 years old. You're going through massive changes, and then it's very stressful because there's no real time to ease into your whatever school identity because within the second year, I think like a barely within a 9 month or 10 month of second year of school, you have to take this really really big exam, and the A levels, that's what I call it. So that's the British system, the advanced papers. And if you fail in those papers, you don't do well in those papers, your past 2 years in the JC would be wasted because you don't get a diploma or anything out of it. This is a streaming system. This is kind of like a pre-university system. So if you succeed in this, you get essentially a higher chance to go to a good university, a good college. The tensions, the stresses that happen inside this is so, as Alana said, this is a very specific kind of experience. So we're talking about people whose education, social class backgrounds, come from nuclear families, etc. All these kind of things, right? While it's kind of like a very specific, on the other hand, it is also kind of reminiscent for a lot of people who did go through such, I guess, an intensive educational system. And of course, this being about youth, right, is very much about trying to have fun as well as dealing with this kind of tensions inside there. Yeah. So over back to you, Alana. I'll go to the next
Yeah.
slide.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Even though it's a very specific experience, it's actually ubiquitous enough that even people who don't go through the system know about it and understand that okay, it is a academic heavy sort of path and so on and so forth. So even if they didn't go through it, they know of it, um, even if they don't necessarily relate to it. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next example, using culture as content. So I'm going to show you a video of the gameplay of the. Before you click play, let me just give a
Yeah,
very quick explanation
yeah.
of what this
Right.
is.
I'm
So,
just hot getting ready. Yeah.
with your finger trigger
Yeah.
button. So essentially, this game was written for the National Heritage Board of Singapore. It is a game that was written. This particular game was written in 2020 when the COVID situation happened. So the National Heritage Board, they do these walking tours for cultural buildings, heritage buildings in Singapore. Obviously, when COVID happened, these walking tours could not go on. So they asked people to put in pictures for something that could be done online. So this was our kind of response to it. So what you're going to be seeing is a gameplay of a kind of escape game, online escape game that it's wholly played in the browser. So there are no downloads were needed. Yeah. So as the game goes, as the video goes on, I'll explain what you're seeing. Shall let's go.
Okay.
So this is just the opening page, and I was forced to put the play game button right there. Okay, but it's going to go. So essentially, we are. This is a 360 sort of thing. So you could turn the screen 360 to see a lot of different things. This little red nubs that you see, if you mouse over them, they'll give you little bits of information on parts of the building. So this is a Victoria Concert Hall, one of the heritage buildings in Singapore. Um, and then there are kind of like codes and clues you have to look for to go into the next stage. So, yep, this is us going in, and then you can see different parts. So this game was specifically for the civic district. We were given kind of like buildings to look at and things to do, like specific kind of like teaching moments in the game, and then we wrote this game for them. So, when we think about culture as content, the idea, of course, this is completely different now compared to the one that both games are commissioned to a certain extent, but this one is a very, I would say, didactic sort of approach to culture, where basically there was a walking route. And I was given the walking route script to say, okay, I need you to write a game that can help to cover the gap um, that we are going to be experiencing for the next 2 years in this game. So, next slide, if you don't mind, Shao. Thank you.
Hold on. Oops. Sorry, it played this video instead.
No
Let me just
worries.
go back. Okay. All right.
Yep. So the if you look at this game, the two pictures on the side, right? The first one is the national symbols, and that was the first game that we wrote. Actually, it was popular enough that they asked us to go back to write another one for them, for the Malay Heritage Center, which was currently actually going through renovation. So they wanted again something online to fill that gap while the Heritage Center was closed. Um, so I was very lucky because the National Heritage Board was quite open with how we used the information that was given to us, uh, as long as we didn't completely make history up. So if we had things very specifically that okay, this is the informational bit and this is the game bit, and this were kind of like very nicely drawn out. They were very happy for us to kind of like go ahead and do whatever we wanted. um, and it was really popular. Like kids, I mean, it's targeted at younger younger kids, so um, primary school kids, and they really enjoyed it. I was told that people were still coming back to it like 3 years after the game had been released. So it was a new and engaging way to look at cultural artifacts and heritage buildings. And personally, for me, I do enjoy looking at physical spaces and the environment to try to play games with what's around me rather than always kind of like making things up. So this is a good opportunity for me to design these style of games, I think. And obviously something very particularly culturally related, heritage related, and um, yeah, I think I learned a lot while writing these games in terms of like culture and heritage. And I tried to put those educational bits of things that really stood out to me in the game as well, and in the puzzles, obviously. So I
Yeah,
guess that's another branch that like culture as content,
yeah,
using culture as the big chunk, I guess, of the game that you're presenting. So like writing the game around the culture rather than using it as a setting. Does that make sense? Yeah. So
okay.
these are the first two branches. So culture as a draw, culture as content, and Charles going to talk a little bit about Swordfarer, zine that we wrote last year,
Mm, okay.
using and talking about culture as nuance.
Okay. So yeah, thank you, Alana. So actually, before I go into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about something to add on for the last two things that we had. Is that okay?
Yeah,
For
yeah, go ahead.
your two things. Okay, so the thing about just for some local bureaucratic context, right? So the Singlet game and the Heritage game that we created, the Singlet games was commissioned to us by the Arts Festival, but also by the Singapore Book Council. So these are non-profit organizations, the NPOs, right? That are essentially in charge. They have a for the Writers Festival. It's kind of like they have one big KPI for the year, which is the KPI is all right. We've got to kind of create a big writers festival, inviting people from across the world, from Asia, from Southeast Asia, from everywhere, to do a few days kind of things. And so our game stuff happened within one of the programming of that. So people were going around. It was a literary festival, and whatever we did was, I think my joke to Lana is that we are kind of creating essentially we're helping people create fanfic engines for books that they particularly enjoy, and so people sales of those books they go up at the festival. So it was this kind of like a hyper bespoke, hyper focused, and a little bit cozy because you have few hours to talk to someone when you're running the game. Then for the heritage games, right, for the context of Singapore, we have like bureaucracies and ministries in charge of everything. So the literature is put under art for some reason. So literature is a literary art, so it's put under Singapore's. We have a national council for taking art, the national council. Therefore, heritage is under this thing called the Heritage Board, the National Heritage Board, which basically keeps it's kind of like within its domain is to make sure that heritage buildings, heritage symbols, for example, physical things like our version of a declaration of like the drafts of the Constitution, all these kind of things, right? So we have essentially monuments, we have relics, we have like the artifacts that are sort of like kept in. And a big challenge for the arts or for working in museums is that in Singapore, our museums have transformed recently into trying to work with more interactive kind of experiences, right? And but there's still a lot of a draw of like the sense of is it able to make museum work, right? I guess sexier to people. Then I think like the success that we had with our heritage games, right, was especially kind of like cool for people because it's like, hey, now we can actually show our stuff as content. We can show our stuff as something that people could potentially be interested in. They can use it as a didactic way to teach us. So the relationship between this us and the single games and heritage games experiences are quite different because this one we work with the authors directly. There was free and change things. This one, certain narratives and historiographical approaches, we had to keep to them to kind of like work within the needs of the clients. Yeah, so that's just kind of like where I'm going with that. Okay. All right, so yeah, and so back over to mine, right? I just wanted to kind of like establish that because I thought those will be useful for the context to give context to whatever Alana shared. So for the last one, basically, this is most traditionally a TTRPG in the sense. So it happened because I was actually the context for this game is a bit odd. It's a bit funny because I was actually taking part in this thing called the awards, right? The one that if you've heard of it, the awards is basically happening right now. It's the one basically by the look at this I got the coordinator who runs the awards, and very much it's basically in the group of like judges that come together. We read a whole ton of RPGs. Then some of the RPGs that I ended up reading was actually Furry Games Firelights, all right. So basically, as part of many games that I was in charge of judging as a judge for the awards, that was something that I was playing with a lot because as a judge for the awards, I was the games that I read, I tried to play them as much as possible. And this being a solo journey game was something that was easier for me to play with by myself, because I also had to keep my identity secret as a judge on awards for the previous year. So I couldn't go around, hey, can I play a game with you so that I can understand how this game works, right? So for me, I played around with this game of Firelights, and what Firelights did was that it was basically what we call a Metroidvania style game. So it's kind of like a game that you used to evoke. The thing in TTRPG, indie scene, we also have like the idea of genre emulation, right? We'll try to emulate other genres of media like video games, etc. And the big part of the draw for me for playing Firelights was the sense that I could use it to evoke, right, a sense of going through a large, vast, forbidding place, made popular in video games such as Dark Souls, Castlevania, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Spirit of the Forest. So all these games are basically digital games that kind of like allow you to travel into a vast and gloomy world and make sense of things. You're a small person in a big world. And that was actually the feeling that I got, right? That I wanted to capture when we created Swordfarer. So Swordfarer is a wuxia game, so Chinese martial arts and fantasy, sword fighting fantasy. And again, we're going to talk about culture as nuance here, right? Now, what is wuxia is something that people could spill a lot of ink and blood over, and it wouldn't really be resolved. So I'm not really a genre formalist on this, but there's some vibes that I have as a person coming from the Sinosphere that I have certain predilections and certain approaches to it. So this game isn't really about martial arts per se. So when people see wuxia, they think, all right, this should begin with like fancy martial arts. There must be supernatural powers. There must be gods. There must be demons. And this is where basically I say like, wuxia. A lot of people could say different things about it, but my wuxia game didn't actually have a lot of emphasis on martial arts. So if you're looking at the painting, this is it's basically open access. And of course, the question of why this painting is open access under the Creative Commons is also another public domain is still another issue. So these are paintings by an eccentric painter called Zheng Banqiao, who's famed for drawing for painting bamboos, right? So I decided to kind of like put in a lot of extremely uh, culturally Chinese kind of things inside here. And inside here, the main thing about it is this is called Jianghu, which is Jianghu is basically the rivers and lakes, literally translated, which basically relates to over the kind of like in the martial arts context, it will be mysterious secret society or powerful people. But I wanted to not just talk about that. I wanted to talk about something else. I wanted to take a more philosophical, anthropological approach to it. I wanted the game to be sort of like a imagination into what a Chinese like thing might be coming from someone. I'm Southeast Asian. I'm Chinese. I come from school systems which were essentially bilingual. And when I was a kid, the kind of education system I went through, in addition to reading Shakespeare, I also had to read a lot of basically Chinese poetry and philosophy. So I wanted to take a more Chinese take on wuxia to have more cultural nuances that I wouldn't say I'm representing all Southeast Asians, all Chinese, all creators, whatever, but something that is a little bit personal from me, right? Because it's like I grew up in this exact time period. If like the teenage textbook was something that essentially people read from if like I was from an Anglophone kind of background in Singapore, if you read a lot of English books, the teenage textbook is something that is probably something you connect with a lot because it's about essentially about student culture in the 80s and 90s. For me, I am a bit older, so essentially where I grew up, essentially martial arts stuff was actually not something that I was allowed to read. It was considered to be like pulp fiction. It's basically it was considered to be not right to read for young people because you give us wrong ideas about violence, about clan loyalties. And there's a lot of echoes between martial arts in wuxia as well as secret societies and gang culture that I'll talk about in a very short while. All right. So you see here, right? I've done a little like excerpt from the game. Okay, so you can kind of rest your eyes on that when I'm going through things. Is in wuxia, I want to talk a lot about this thing called the jianghu. The jianghu is often understood as hidden secret societies or powerful martial artists with lawsuits, secret techniques, etc. And it's something which has an enduring draw. So if you play, for example, Vampire the Masquerade, for example, the ideas of a secret Camarilla society, you can see the draw there. It's like how I'm part of a secret world that exists, like in a parallel to and like within this, and of course the recent movies of like in the last 10 years of like the John Wick film series. I have to mention the film series because in the RPG field, John Wick will refer to a very different person. So the Keanu Reeves movies of the John Wick series, in which secret societies or assassins and criminals and having their things. That's a very, for me as a Chinese watching that, it was like that's a very much of a kind of almost a love letter, not over to the concept Jianghu. So Jianghu is something which is a common understanding of this secret societies, martial artists, etc. But actually, for people in the Sinosphere, the word Jianghu also has other meanings. And within Singapore, Jianghu has a lot of different broad meanings that could occur here. So, for example, recently in Singapore, one of our most talented and hardworking athletes recently retired at a relatively young age, and basically he was going to do other things and so on. This young man, Joseph Schilling, and so people could say, oh, this athlete has left the athletic field. He has 退出 Jianghu. He has left the Jianghu. He has left the rivers and the lakes. All right. If, for example, for me, locally in Singapore, I've been working a lot of things in freelance work, working on indie stuff, working Alana on our events, and I haven't been kind of going to play as many games or organized gameplay as much as I wanted to. So sometimes when I go over to events, people say, "Oh, you have returned to the Jianghu," and so it's a phrase which we don't even use it like to exaggerate. It's not like things. It's a bit of a semi-mystical. There's a little bit of mystic to it. Like, okay, the Jianghu is like the world of human endeavor with its own rules, etiquette, etc., its own figures. But it is also has its negative elements because Jianghu could also be used as a way to socially pressure people. Newspapers and medias could use the phrase Jianghu to like, oh, look at how this person is doing things. This is a letdown to other people in the Jianghu. How can you face society, etc.? Because I mean, Chinese cultural norms of like the essentially we have a very long period of feudal history and a very long era of essentially basically looking at face, looking at what society would think, right? And so we look over at my random tables. So for Fari Games' uh, Firelights, right? Basically, I kind of like work a little bit with that same system in which we have a D66 to work with for like creating notes and vibes for your inspirations for all your different kind of encounters you may find in the martial arts world. So you see here, these are features, teams, events, persons, which I've created to be somewhat more of a mood board to kind of like evoke essentially Chinese sword fighting fiction, right? And what happens is that instead of being something about high fantasy teams that are basically more driven high fantasy, notice here these are basically a lot more the features that you get a lot more vibes of like something you could see perhaps in the Chinese drama or maybe something you read about you see in the Chinese paintings, or maybe hear about in just conversations with people. The people they meet, the teams, events are all much more drawn over from a rural Chinese context. And so what I really wanted to do was, if Firelights in a way is about going through a vast and scary world where there are undead and monsters, and there's a dark fantasy slash hopeful fantasy. My game isn't really just about looking through physical space, but it's also examining social and cultural spaces. As you kind of wander through the Jianghu, you meet people, you make enemies, and you make friends with people. So I made the deck for essentially our game is based on a deck of cards for the solo journey purposes. It creates an emergent map system. This is not my innovation. This is Fari Games' Firelight Central system that I developed. So I've created a Jianghu deck. You're literally going through this physical, social, cultural space known as the Jianghu. You're meeting various people, interesting people, enemies, and there's an element for me to put in cultural nuance as well. Of like, I put in certain Mahayana Buddhist elements there, Confucian elements, Taoist elements. So you see my art style, we chose to work with things that are from the Creative Commons as well. And of course, the fact that the Creative Commons is another kind of nod over to our Chinese historical experience, because so many of our paintings and things were collected or were looted during the 19th century and 20th century, right? So that's why they happen with Creative Commons, because the museums that hold to them have very, very graciously add them to the public record. So the way for me using this is to attempt to reclaim, right, some aspects of my I guess like this kind of things to put it over into games, right? And so you can see here, essentially, I chose not to. It was a very deliberate marketing decision as well, because one of the easy ways for me to make this game sell, I guess, more to I guess a generic, a wider, broader audience. So if I made the thing, if I kind of like marketed it over to what maybe people understood to be wuxia. So if, for example, if people understood wuxia to be all full of jumping around, flying swords, and like magical weapons, for example, if you are on like a wuxia world or some other kind of website where you read a lot of web fiction, then maybe expect supernatural powers, you expect gods and demons. But my game is very, very much rooted over in a certain kind of anthropological cultural kind of like a tourism right into ancient China that might not have existed. And if you look at my stats inside here, right, so I put inside here the cultural aesthetics and book and sword. So in Chinese, we have this phrase called Wen Wu Song Quan, which means you are good in both book and sword. So you are strong in literature as well as in martial arts. So that's something that basically people try to imagine as the Confucian gentleman should be somebody whose martial arts is good as well as learned and knowledgeable. But I put in a new thing called wine because people in Wuxia seem to get sloshed all the time. People are drinking all the time. So these are three character abilities: your book, your sword, which are much more Confucian and respectable, and wine, which is something a little bit more Taoist, a bit more hanging out, letting it chill up and moving around. And I also put in inside there, right? Like I use the four suits of cards, right, in the deck. I tied it over to four occupations, which is a ancient Chinese Confucian legalist idea of like putting people into: are you a peasant? Are you a merchant? Are you a scholar? Are you an artisan, a laborer? And so the people you meet, right, when you draw the cards as an emergent player, because you'll be meeting and interacting with people from different kind of occupations with their own jianghu, with their own social, cultural worlds, own values and beliefs. Then again, going back to Firelights. Firelights, you're wandering around, a tiny insect, a zombie, an undead going through a dark world. Then this one, the world is less dark because you're not there to basically fight undead. You're there to interact with people. Maybe you make friends with people, make enemies, feuds happen, misunderstandings, forgiveness. All this is kind of like the meat and drink of essentially the kind of pulpy genre fiction, right? That makes out of wuxia. And I chose not to put in some of the more, I guess I would just like, I guess I can say it because I'm Chinese, but like there's a strong elements of gendered problems in wuxia as a genre. There's a lot of incelly kind of behavior in wuxia. It's like the main characters for no reasons is like women flock after them, etc. It's become a bit of a joke on the online. It's like, oh, okay, yes, it's a bit like the same problem with anime, which isekai anime, the wish fulfillment genre. When you have something that's a mass culture, pop culture, you're going to have the lowest common denominator. In this case, you're going to try to appeal to men with like the power fantasies and wish fulfillment men, right? So I decided to move away from that, right, to go into something that's a bit more philosophical. It's a bit more, when I was a kid growing up, reading wuxia comics and books, the kind of wuxia inside there often had a lot of discussions to Chinese history, culture, and the broadness of like also talking about India, the Middle East, talking about Iran, because all the big ancient classical cultures. So there's a lot of like these things that I wanted to do with Swordfarer. And that's pretty much from, I guess, me. Yeah, and yeah, like Alana, what do you think we should do next with this?
We should start to wind down soon.
Okay,
So we
sure, sure.
actually, so Shao and I were joking earlier that, oh, we're not sure whether we could fill the 50 minutes, and we actually filled it all the way up. We have
Yeah,
about
yeah,
two
we could.
minutes left. Actually, we have two questions, but
Okay,
I'm not sure if we can go very in depth into them. But
okay,
I know that there's a Discord channel that we can hop to later. So
okay,
if we don't sufficiently explain your questions, maybe you can join us in the Discord channel. So the first question: what's your visibility on Chinese language or Indonesian language RPGs and related art scenes? So with regards to escape rooms or Sha or Chinese language video games. And the second question is, what about culture? Do you find yourself jumping off from when you start work on an RPG? So is it architecture, environment, or one of the three Fs that I mentioned? Um, I'm just going to go very quickly into the Chinese language and Indonesian language RPGs question first. Unfortunately, I don't have any insight into the Indonesian language RPGs, but I know Aaron asked that question. Maybe Aaron has better better insight into that. Um, but for Chinese language, actually, I've been kind of paying attention to the Sha and escape room scene for Chinese language, and definitely, Sha is much more popular there than escape rooms. Because Sha tends to go in towards the drama side of it, and they really enjoy that, like the drama and the thrill, and there's a scare, there's them acting as the detective, or there's them putting on a role. Escape rooms, not so much. Like if they play escape rooms, they like the ones with the thrill rather than the puzzle solving. I don't know whether that's kind of what you were going for, but happy to talk more about it in Discord, especially if you have any exciting things to share with me. The first question, I
Nice.
think we have to take it to Discord because we are just like 30 seconds down. But I just want
Yeah.
to, yeah,
Okay.
just want to share our website, curiouschimeras.com. Our games are there. The games that we write are there. Swordfarer is there if you want to buy it. It's in digital form at the moment. We're also on different social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you want to talk to us, you can email us as well. Our emails are on the slides. So yeah, Shao, any last final words in the last 2 seconds?
Yeah, thank you very much, and have a great big bag online. There's a lot of knowledge inside our panel, so I hope you have a great stay here. Thank you very much for joining us
Thanks very
today.
much for joining us.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right.